All right, we're just going to zoom in on one of those capabilities for the moment. I'll just go back to the previous slide for a moment. So creative and critical and creative thinking, which is one of the general capabilities to support students to be a successful learner. And we'll do that because of its particular focus on thinking. However, the development of thinking skills is evident obviously in all three dimensions of the Australian curriculum, but it gets a special mention here. With respect to thinking, it's worth knowing that there's no cognitive framework that underpins the development of thinking in the Australian curriculum. To highlight the development of thinking across the curriculum, the QCAA has used the Mazzano and Kendall framework from 2007 as a lens to identify and categorize the cognitive verbs in the achievement standards and content descriptions. So let's talk about this from a Queensland perspective for a little while. So what is a cognitive verb? A cognitive verb is a word that signals a thinking action. For example, explaining, describing, or evaluating. And it's important to understand that the thinking processes associated with the cognitive verbs are the cognitive verbs in the curriculum which indicate what thinking processes students will need to activate in order to demonstrate their learning. And cognitive verbs can be found within each of the processes. Cognitive skills can be found within each of the processes, sorry. So I'm going to clarify this in a moment with reference to the primary cognitive verb toolkit. Before I do this, now this resource is available online, and we'll point in a few slides time to where you'll be able to find that. But what QCAA has done is identified and mapped cognitive verbs across the Australian curriculum learning area, achievement standards and content descriptions. And this resource that you see on the screen is the Categories of Common Cognitive Verbs document. This is the document that categorises the cognitive verbs found in the Australian curriculum using Mazzano and Kendall's 4 levels of cognitive processing. Retrieval, might be a little bit hard to read on the screen, but retrieval, comprehension, analysis, and knowledge utilisation. The 4 levels, which are across the top here, include a description for each level. So under the descriptions, you can see the subcomponents or typical actions students may be engaged in. And the third row, this one here, it comprises the cognitive verbs that have been identified in the Australian curriculum for each of the 4 levels of cognitive processing. That is for retrieval, comprehension, analysis, and knowledge utilisation. The key to understanding this document is the word common. The cognitive verbs in this list are found across more than one learning area and considered common across learning areas and year levels. So for example, I don't know if any of you saw the series of analytical response webinars that we've been running and will be continuing to run over the next few weeks, but they demonstrate how analyze, for example, is used across English and the arts, HASS, the 3 HASS subjects, science and HPE. So when planning for the alignment of thinking, it's important to understand that the Australian curriculum achievement standards describe the learning expected of students at year level or bands and include what is taught and assessed, and the content descriptions describe what is taught and what students are expected to learn. Alignment of the teaching, learning and assessment of cognitive processes is important in supporting students' development and mastery of thinking processes within the learning area. All right, so that's the theory, and as I said, this support document we'll come back to, but let's look at it in a bit of practicality now. I'm going to use Year 4 as an example here, but you could do exactly the same activity that we're doing here with any of the achievement standards. So in the achievement standard for year 4, you'll see that I've highlighted in pink the relative cognitive verbs for a unit of work that will be the focus here. So understanding, creating, and explaining. That's what's in pink there. I've highlighted in green the context for the complexity of thinking around that. So, for example, understanding will happen in the context of texts that have different structures depending on purpose and context, and creating will happen in the context of structured texts which explain ideas for different audiences. And you'll notice that those happen in the receptive and the productive modes. So, for example, students could be asked to write an informative text such as a newspaper article. We can assess in the receptive mode a student's understanding of a print news article text structure for a public audience. In the productive mode, students will be able to demonstrate their skill to create a print news article to explain ideas for a public audience. Because the achievement stand indicates in the receptive mode that by the end of year 4, students understand that texts have different text structures, plural, depending on purpose and audience, students' folios of work will need to include examples of other texts that they've also composed for different purposes and different contexts. Similarly, in the productive mode, students will need to create other structured texts, plural, to explain ideas for different audiences. And the texts that are created for different audiences will include imaginative, persuasive, and possibly other informative texts. And please note there are other understanding skills in the achievement standard we can assess when students write a print article for a public audience. We've just honed in on some sample ones here. All right, so let's have a look at this a bit more closely at the cognitive verbs in the productive mode for year 4. Other than those already highlighted, so that's create and explain that I've highlighted in pink, can you just in the chat box share one other cognitive verb that you can see in the achievement standard? So just pop that into the chat box. Do we have a starter for this activity? Anyone find the first one? Thank you, Nicola. All right, great. Thanks for that. Highlighted are the ones which we would recognize from the cognitive verb toolkits as the cognitive verbs, and they're use, understand, create, make, and demonstrate understanding. Right now, there's a lot of information that I've given to you pretty quickly there about the cognitive verbs, but QCA has created resources designed to support teachers by identifying whether cognitive verbs exist in the achievement standards and content descriptions, and by providing a framework that allows you to unpack the cognitive verbs for students and highlight the associated thinking that helps students to use these verbs meaningfully. There are maps of cognitive verbs in English and the other learning areas that you can access on the website. You can see this one's for year 6. They also provide document that's it provides document that's easily